Ok, bueno, muchas gracias a todos por unirse a esta actividad. Quizás algunos de ustedes ya escucharon, pero le explicaba a Peter que gentilmente aceptó en formar parte de este panel que introduciría un poco en qué consiste el panel mismo y a él, ¿no? Y luego en castellano, y luego comenzaríamos con el panel mismo. La idea del panel básicamente era tener a Peter con nosotros y conversar fundamentalmente sobre dos cosas. En primer lugar, conversar sobre su podcast, History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, un poco sobre el origen, cómo se fue desarrollando el podcast con el tiempo, ya tiene más de 10 años, y cuáles son en este momento los planes de desarrollo del podcast hacia el futuro. Y luego en una segunda parte, que durará también unos 20 minutos, tratar de hablar acerca de la historia de la filosofía, de la práctica de la historia de la filosofía hoy en día, en el fondo temas, si ustedes quieren, como un poco más metafilosóficos, ¿no? Sobre esta subdisciplina de la profesión, ¿no? Quisiera decir, por último, algunas cosas sobre Peter mismo. Él actualmente es profesor de filosofía antigua tardía y filosofía islámica en el MU Múnich. Estuvo antes de esto, comenzó con esa posición en Múnich el 2012, me parece. Estuvo por algo más de una década en el Departamento de Filosofía de King's College London, como profesor de filosofía antigua y medieval, sucediendo en esa posición a Richard Sorabji. Ha publicado un número muy grande de monografías y libros editados en temas súper variados, que cubren desde la teología de Aristóteles y Plotino, la historia de los conceptos de salud y animal, y el pensamiento de filósofos árabes como Avicena, Averroes y Al-Kindi. Quizás solo por nombrar algunas de las cosas que Peter ha publicado en todos estos temas. Se encuentra la monografía de Arabic Plotinus, a Philosophical Study of the Theology of Aristotle, luego Interpreting Avicenna por Cambridge University Press, y también el Cambridge Companion to Arabic Philosophy, también publicado por Cambridge University Press. Por supuesto, está la serie de libros que se inició un tiempo después de que comenzó el podcast, publicado por Oxford University Press, precisamente con los capítulos que Peter ha ido publicando. Según entiendo, por aquí se me puede estar pasando algún tomo, ya han salido volúmenes sobre el periodo clásico, el periodo romano y helenístico, la tradición islámica, la tradición medieval y la filosofía india. Bien, dejo entonces la introducción hasta ahora y comienzo con el panel. All right, Peter. So that was the introduction. So maybe the first theme I wanted to ask you is about the origins of the podcast History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. I mentioned in introduction that you started with the podcast about 10 years ago. And I just wanted to know, what were you up to at that time when you started the podcast? Was it something that you were thinking for some time? Did you think, for instance, that maybe there was a need for a podcast of this nature, and that maybe none of the philosophy podcasts in the market back then were maybe fulfilling that purpose?
Yeah, that was definitely a big part of it. I mean, I actually listened to a lot of podcasts myself, and even then I was interested in philosophy podcasts. You would think that actually it would make a lot of sense for me to listen to podcasts about anything other than philosophy, because I spend all day doing philosophy, but I just couldn't help myself. So I was listening to other podcasts on philosophical topics, which at that time, there were not very many, right? And so that was part of it, but it was also because I was listening to podcasts about history. So I'm very interested in history as sort of an offshoot of my interest in the history of philosophy. And I just thought it would be really cool if someone did a podcast about philosophy, but in the style of a history podcast.
Right.
So in particular, one of my big inspirations was a podcast called The History of Rome.
Oh, right.
which tells the whole history of Rome from the mythical founding till the fall of the Western Empire in something like 180 episodes. And I was really struck by how detailed and continuous it was. So, I mean, with that level of attention and that much time, you can explain, you know, why did the left flank collapse in such and such a battle, right? And I just thought, you know, something, since I work on kind of obscure areas of philosophy, something that always frustrates me a little bit about teaching philosophy is that you don't have time to cover it in this complete way, like without any gaps, which is the slogan of the podcast. And it just occurred to me that if I were doing a podcast, I could go as fast or rather as slow as I wanted. Right. And so that's really why I did it.
Yeah. So that's interesting, because like maybe with the perspective of a decade from that moment, one wonders, how did you envision this project back then, right? I mean, you said that you had the History of Rome podcast model, as it were, but then you've gone on for more than 400, almost 500 episodes. So let's say that wasn't your thought, well, I mean, if I make it to Plato, that'll be all right, and people will remember that at least I did something good with my time on the internet or something like that? Or were you thinking hypothetically of eventually reaching, I don't know, 16th century or where you are right now, or maybe 20th century?
Well, I think actually there was an original version of episode 1 where I speculated that I might go up to Kant.
Right, yeah.
So I was imagining going for a long time. And actually, since then, I sort of came to the conclusion that if I did get that far, it would be kind of strange to stop at Kant and not do the 19th century. But I also said in the original version that I would not do China and India, which obviously I've changed. So right. I now we have the whole book on India, and we'll be doing China, or I'm doing China with a co-author in the coming years as well.
Right. That's the next parallel series that you got.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I can remember someone teasing me about the fact that I numbered the first episode 001 because it implied that I'd put out more than 99 episodes.
Right.
And I remember thinking, well, if I do this, it will certainly take me a few hundred episodes, like 200 or 300 maybe.
Yeah.
Which seemed fantastically ambitious at the time. But now, I mean, I've got more that I think I'm somewhere around the 360s without even counting the episodes on India and Africa. And I'm only up to the Italian Renaissance.
Right. Yeah.
So it's gone very slowly.
Yeah. We'll get back to that. I hope. Do you find yourself working on these projects, or maybe in the script of an episode in a sort of a different way than you were doing that very same job 10 years ago? How has that changed? I mean, I guess that
definitely.
You've become way more efficient, and you somehow have mastered the knack of the podcast host. But which would you say have been the more significant changes that you've noticed in sort of the way you practice this profession?
Well, so one thing is that it's become a lot more detailed and a lot truer to the without any gaps slogan. So I think you can really see this in the difference between the first volume that came out and the subsequent volumes. So the first volume sort of reads like an introduction to philosophy up to the time of Aristotle, with some additional things you wouldn't expect necessarily, right? But if I were doing it now, there'd probably be at least another 15 or 20 episodes in this. So I would have, maybe not that many, but I would have covered things like Herodotus and Thucydides, for sure. Like I wouldn't have even wondered whether to cover them. So for example, recently I did an episode on Renaissance Italian historians.
It's a good one.
And so that's one change, is that I've become even more committed to the idea of not leaving anything out, partially because once I started putting the podcast out, when I got criticisms, the criticisms are almost always of the form, hey, why didn't you do this thing? Like, why did you skip this? And it might be something incredibly obscure, but somebody cares about it, you know?
Right, yeah.
I do occasionally get people complaining that it's taking me forever and like, can I please get to the 17th century? But much more, it seems like, you know, if I'm going to do this, then I should really commit to the without any gaps idea.
Yeah.
So that's one difference. The other main difference is that when I started, I had no plan of turning them into books. And so it was really much, I mean, actually, in a way, now it's less efficient. I mean, you're right that I've got more practice, but when I first started doing it, like when I wrote, let's say, the podcast about Parmenides, I literally just picked up the Kirk-Raven and Schofield's
Right. Yeah.
edition and translation of the fragments of the Pre-Socratics, kind of paged through it to remind myself, but I probably spent, you know, half an hour doing that. And then I just sat down and banged out a little essay about Parmenides from my head, right? Whereas now, a typical episode, I probably spend, I don't know, maybe 10 to 15 hours reading before I start writing the script, depending a little bit on what it's about and how much I already know. But so when it started, in part because I kind of already knew a lot about the Pre-Socratics, Plato and Aristotle, there wasn't that much research that went into it. Whereas now, I mean, for me, uncharted territory. And so I have to effectively like give myself a crash course on every new topic to write each episode. And I'm thinking about it as a book. So it has footnotes, it has references. So I'm basically writing a book manuscript as I write the podcast. So it's much more polished and, you know, well thought through than it was when I started, where I just really was kind of giving myself something to read from, kind of for an oral presentation.
Right. Yeah. No, that's very interesting. And I don't know if this is a controversial question, but what would you think? It's the main fault, I mean, or let's say vice or neglect of philosophy podcasts on the internet. I mean, what I'm thinking is that from all you've learned through all these years, right? I mean, I guess like there's something you could say that the history of philosophy without any gaps brings to the table. What do you feel sometimes philosophers miss when they do this set of things, or which would be like the more common mistake or fault, or maybe something that one could bear in mind if, let's say, one has something in along these lines to upload to the web and maybe start, obviously not something just like what you've been doing, but I don't know. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I actually think that the offering of philosophy podcasts is quite good. For one thing, there are different formats. So some are scripted, some are more spontaneously delivered, and a lot of them are interviews. So like Philosophy Bites is interviews,
Right. Yeah.
Elucidations is interviews, the Unmute podcast is interviews. So that's probably the most common format, actually. And that makes sense because philosophy is a dialogical activity, right? I actually, for that reason, I include interviews. Every 5 episodes or so, there's an interview in my series. So I guess I don't really have any criticisms as such to make of the philosophy podcasts that are out there. I think it's important to remember that a podcast is not substitute for university level education in philosophy, though, because I mean, there's a certain level of complexity and kind of relentless inquiry into exactly how arguments work and whether arguments are convincing. There's, to a certain extent, you just cannot do that in a podcast. So if you think about trying to recreate, you know, like a really good seminar, say a reading seminar on Plato, like what we used to do when we were both in London back in the day. I mean, you could record one of those and throw it up on the internet, but really the whole point is you have to be taking part in it yourself. Right. And so the mere fact that podcasts are consumed passively means that there's already something missing there. Like you're not being asked to formulate your own critical engagement with the topic. On the other hand, there are some things that a podcast can do that university education cannot. So I already mentioned that I could never cover the history of philosophy in anything like this level of detail in teaching. And another another example would be Barry Lamb's podcast, Hi-Fi Nation, which is it's sort of like the podcast This American Life, but about philosophy. So it's narratives. He always says it's philosophy in story form.
Right.
And it's very well produced. It's got music. It's got a mix of interviews and Barry, I guess, reading from something that he's written in advance. And it's very very much telling an audio story about a philosophical topic. And that is not anything like you could do in a classroom. So I think, I sort of think the two things have different purposes, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I wanted to ask you, Peter, maybe getting back to something you said before. This idea or thought you had that, well, I mean, if you made it to Cannes, that would be, maybe more than enough as far as goals go for the podcast. But which ones would you say have been the milestones of the podcast throughout this 10 years? I mean, maybe if you had to, perhaps institutionally speaking, think of 2-3 moments where you said, okay, so this is really progressing, probably will not only made it to the 15th, 16th century, but probably even beyond Kant. And yeah, it just seems something that has its own, let's say, inner nature, as Aristotle would put it.
So maybe 3 things. One I already mentioned, which is the decision to start putting them out as books, because that affects the way I think about it, the way I write it quite a bit.
Right.
And maybe the next thing would be, and I'm sort of doing this chronologically, the next thing, which I think was important in a way I did not anticipate, was when I got to late ancient Christian philosophy. So Augustine, the Greek church fathers, and so on. And the reason why that was important is that apart from knowing something about Augustine, that was really the first time where I had to produce about 15 or so episodes where I didn't know almost anything about the topic. So like I had to write an episode about the Cappadocians, about Maximus Confessor, and so on.
Right, yeah.
And that's really where I kind of shifted from like telling people what I already mostly sort of knew from my area of specialty and filling in bits where I needed to kind of remind myself or learn stuff that I didn't know yet. The first time it was more like, well, I know little bits, but mostly I have to find out everything, was when I got to the late ancient Christians. Then it got easier again when I was doing the Islamic world. But especially since I've gotten to Byzantium, I mean, the time where I could rely on the fact that I already kind of knew the stuff, at least some of the time, that's long ago. So now it's a learning process for me, which is great. I actually enjoy that a lot. But that's changed my attitude towards the podcast. So it's much less about telling people things about what I already teach and research. Now it's much more telling people things I just learned myself in the last week or two.
Yeah.
And then the third thing, which we've already alluded to, was the decision to start covering non-European philosophical traditions other than the Islamic world, which of course I could cover because that's my area of specialty. And I actually hesitated a lot about that because I knew that I couldn't do it competently. Like I knew I couldn't just sit down and write a good book about Indian or Chinese philosophy, right? And so I decided to team up with co-authors to cover these other traditions. And Janardhan Ganaria and I did the Indian series. Chike Jeffers and I now are doing the Africana series. And in the future, I'll do China with Karen Lai. So that's really changed the process a lot, because what I do is, I should maybe explain that I put them out in alternating weeks. Yeah. So there's a co-authored week about a non-European tradition, and then there's a week where I do it myself, which is about the European tradition. So at the moment we're doing Africana and Renaissance Italy at the same time.
Right, yeah.
And of course, collaborating with someone is a very different process than just doing it yourself. And it also means that I'm sort of bouncing back and forth between, like, I'll be working on Frederick Douglass and then I'll be working on Machiavelli.
Exactly, yeah, it's a bit of a...
So I'm kind of always, it means I'm trying to keep track of two philosophical narratives at the same time, which is also quite interesting, actually.
Yeah, it's interesting what you mentioned, because so another thing I was wondering about the podcast relates precisely to the alternative series, as it were, or like the ones that somehow depart from the standard Western history of philosophy line. And the question I had is whether you sort of have found yourself maybe reacting to what has become now a very noticeable trend in philosophy departments in the Western world, to pay more attention to, let's say, minor figures in the history of philosophy, or philosophers that could have belonged to minority or marginalized groups. So I think like the whole project like looks really well, considering the trends that seem to be emerging right now. But of course, this is something that you were able to detect, or at least that interested you some time ago. I mean, not for nothing, you already have the Classical Indian Philosophy volume published by Oxford University Press. The Africana series is in full swing. You got other things in mind. So I guess like the question I had is, did you somehow sense that things were going to move in that direction, or was it something that just interested you and you just pursue that interest?
I mean, maybe somewhere in between. So I mean, it's certainly, I certainly would not take credit for being one of the pioneers of trying to, make everyone interested in non-European philosophy. To the contrary, the only reason that we can do it is that there's already quite a lot of research in these fields that we can, sort of summarize. Actually, a lot of it for India, a lot of it was written by Janardhan Ganeri, my co-author, right? But he's not the only one either. So, I mean, I don't think it would be possible to do a podcast of this kind about a philosophical tradition that hadn't already been getting pretty serious research for a few decades.
Right.
So, for example, if I were going to try to write 20 episodes about philosophy in Thailand, actually, I think probably, like, intrinsically that would be a good idea. So I dare say there is 20 episodes worth of Thai philosophy, but I don't think it would be possible for me to do it, even if I had a collaborator, because I don't think that there's enough literature and philosophical literature and translation and secondary literature about it for me to come to grips with. I might be wrong about that, but that's my suspicion. Whereas something like Korea would be just about possible now.
Right.
China, India, Africa, obviously more than possible. Yeah. So, I mean, the only thing, so I don't, like I said, I don't consider myself in any way like a pioneer or a leader in that respect. I consider myself a follower on what other people have been doing. I think the only thing that I might, sort of a small thing that I might bring to this that's distinctive is that because of my approach in the podcast in general, there's a kind of new reason to do this.
Right. Yeah.
Because I think the reason that's usually offered is, first of all, political, like you're marginalizing these other cultures by ignoring them.
Yeah.
And then philosophical, like, right, okay, maybe Vedanta has something interesting to say about monism and the self.
No,
and
exactly.
If we're interested in these topics, we should go read Vedanta. But I have this kind of other story about why I'm doing it, which is that I'm trying to do the entire history of philosophy. So if there's philosophy, I have to do it.
I have to go there, yeah.
Right. It's just as a matter of policy, even if it's in Thailand, I mean, wherever it is, whenever it is. And the point of that would be not necessarily, for example, to find things in ancient China that are interesting to contemporary philosophers. If that happens as well, that's great. But the point is to just understand the whole history of philosophy everywhere and in every time. So obviously that's not really possible, right? It's certainly not for me, probably not for any one person. But I think the idea that would be sort of the ideal goal of the podcast, gives you a different context for doing so-called global philosophy, which in a lot of ways is less politically problematic.
Right.
Because you don't have to like say, oh, well, if you're not paying attention to this stuff, then you're racist. Instead, my story is something more like, well, if you're not paying attention to this stuff, you're arbitrarily ignoring a big chunk of the history of philosophy. And we're historians of philosophy. We shouldn't do that.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. So I noticed that the sort of a time for this first part of the panel is running up. I just wanted to, sort of get in a cheeky question before we move to the second part of the panel, which relates to the maybe like immediate plans that you have for the podcast. So I remember that you said something at some point in your Renaissance podcast series about this. I mean, where you announced that you will sort of enter modernity through Italian Renaissance, but let's say once you're done with the series that was initiated with that some maybe 30 episodes ago, or maybe 20, I don't remember exactly, which would be the series that, let's say, you'll be pursuing during the coming calendar year, together with, I guess, the Africana series.
Yeah. So actually, I saw someone put in the Q&A a question about doing Latin American philosophy.
Exactly.
So maybe I should first say something about the so-called non-European strand. So Africana philosophy is just coming up to figures who work around 1900. Mm-hmm. And that would actually be the end of the first volume's worth of episodes on Africana. So that will be a book. And then there will be another book's worth of episodes about the 20th century. Mm-hmm. So, and of course, that will be very exciting, right? Harlem Renaissance, W.E.B. Du Bois, Frantz Fanon, Martin Luther King Jr., you name it. And then, so that'll take a while. That'll probably take a couple of years. And then after that, I'm doing classical Chinese philosophy with Karen Lai.
Right.
Now, what I do after that, I'm not sure. I have numerous ideas. One would be to go back and pick up the story of Indian philosophy, because we stopped in about the 8th century CE, and do later Indian philosophy. Another idea I had was to do actually not quite Latin American philosophy, but philosophy in the Americas. And so I would actually start with Native American philosophy, the Aztecs, the Incas, and then tell the story of how colonialism impacted South America, and then do modern Latin American philosophy as the end of that series.
Right.
So I'd really like to do that. And I would like, so I'm hoping to do that at some point. And actually, if you ask me right now what I'm most likely to do right after classical China, it's probably that, actually. Right. But I might do later China, later India. Doing later China plus Korea is quite attractive as well, and Japan. Okay, so that's the non-Western stuff. You can see I'm going to be at this for a while, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
The story about Europe is easier. So as you said, I've been doing the Italian Renaissance for about a year and a half or something. And that also is almost done. Mm-hmm. So I think the last episode in that series will air in February or so. And I mean, February 2021. And then you would think I'd be moving on into the 17th century, because I'm ending with like Bruno and Galileo, who are around 1600. But the problem is that I haven't done the rest of Europe in the 15th and 16th century. And if you actually sit down with this kind of without any gaps idea in mind and try to figure out like what happens in the 15th and 16th century outside of Italy, but in Europe, it turns out that the answer is that a heck of a lot happens. So you have the Protestant Reformation, obviously, and then all of the philosophical fallout of that. You have Northern humanism, you have everything that happens in Britain around that time, including Shakespeare, who I'll cover.
Probably feature, yeah.
And then you have the Catholic Reformation or Counter-Reformation, whatever you want to call it. So you have the like Suarez and Molina and these guys down in Spain, and Portugal. So that's actually going to be a whole book's worth. and I'm going to call that philosophy during the Reformation or something like that.
Right. Yeah, interesting.
So that will keep me busy until at least 2023, I would say.
Yeah, sounds like a lot on your plate, but really wonderful ideas, each of them. All right, so let me now move to perhaps like a few themes that I wanted us to talk about, the history of philosophy in itself, right? And perhaps the first question I had relates to your views about what one could call the history of Western philosophy, right? As a received idea, as it were, right, from modernity, presumably, right? But I don't know. I mean, with more than 400 episodes in your back, how defensible you think that idea still is, right? At least as it has been received in the standard textbook that probably was written until a few decades ago. Well, anyways.
Yeah, I think actually, to be honest, I think that what people really mean when they say history of Western philosophy is history of philosophy in languages we know how to read.
Yeah.
So in other words, you have, this is not so much true anymore, but it used to be that any educated person knew Latin and Greek, and it was reasonable to assume that at least a professional academic would be able to read German and French and English, right? And so actually, Western philosophy is just philosophy that was written in those 5 languages, with a few additional things like, Machiavelli wrote in Italian, Kierkegaard writes in Danish, etc. So there's some kind of weird outliers, but basically, the history of Western philosophy is the history of philosophy that people can read if they were educated in a European setting. And my evidence for that is not so much India and China. So of course, people often can't read Sanskrit and Chinese, but you could say, well, but we also exclude India and China for other reasons, like these are independent developments, even if we concede that they're philosophical, they aren't part of our culture, and what we're interested in is the philosophy of our culture, whoever we are. So the reason I don't really buy that story is that Islamic philosophy, or if you prefer, philosophy written in Arabic, is so obviously part of the story of philosophy that begins in Greece and then happens in Latin medieval culture. So, I mean, even if you have like a kind of old-fashioned understanding of the significance of philosophy in Arabic, which I don't share, but there's this kind of old-fashioned idea that Arabic philosophy kind of fits in between antiquity and the Latin Middle Ages, right? So philosophy kind of gets handed from the Greeks to the Arabic-speaking world and then to the Latins. So the reason I reject this is that actually philosophy just keeps going in the Islamic world, right? But that's a separate issue. My point is that for the most part, people didn't think that they needed to learn Arabic in order to study Western philosophy. But I mean, Averroes lived in Spain. Right? So as I always say, Averroes lived further west than Aquinas did. So I don't really see that there's any way of like dividing up the geography of philosophy that somehow excludes philosophy in Arabic while including philosophy in Greek, Latin, German, French, and English. So I think it's actually, I mean, all of the things that people say about why they want to focus on European philosophy or whatever, I don't think that really has anything to do with, like originally, it wasn't motivated by a conception of the history of philosophy that made any sense ever. It's always a retrospective justification of why we're only reading the philosophical texts that happen to be written in these languages that we know how to read.
Exactly, yeah. It would be like as someone remarked in the questions, the sort of a Bertrand Russell type of history of philosophy.
Yeah, but I mean, I think though that's that in a way, like I'm not really, probably the way I just described that probably sounded quite disdainful and critical, but I don't really mean it that way. I mean, if you can read Latin, Greek, French, German, and English well enough to do expert analysis of all of those languages, you're doing pretty well. If you can also read Italian and Spanish, even better, right?
Right, yeah.
So, I mean, I think to say, well, look, any historian of philosophy kind of has an obligation to learn Arabic and Hebrew and Persian and Sanskrit and Chinese. And actually, even Sanskrit is not enough because a lot of texts from the Indian tradition are written in Tibetan and Pali and so on. I mean, like nobody can do all this, right? So I'm not really saying that people have an obligation to become experts on what people call global philosophy or non-Western philosophy. I'm just saying that one should be aware of why we have that conceptual division. The reason why we have the notion of European or non-Western philosophy is really about, you know, pragmatic considerations about what is available to read, what can we read as classically trained academics. And Bertrand Russell is a perfect example. So he couldn't go off and read Mullah Sadra in Arabic if he wanted to, right? Because he probably didn't know he existed, and if he had, he wouldn't have had access to English translations when he was writing.
So I've been speaking about the Arabics. So I wanted to briefly read, I think, a very interesting anecdote you mentioned in precisely a chapter on the Islamic philosophy book on Averroes, which perhaps could take us to the next question or topic I had in mind. And the text is the following. You say in that chapter, I think chapter 26 of that book, in my heart, I'm going to pick it up from a few lines above. So you said the right answer, I was told when asked about the importance of the study of historical figures, let's say, such as Averroes, is that we can mine the history of philosophy to discover arguments and positions that would speak to today's concerns. So I prepare myself to say, preferably with a straight face, that contemporary philosophers of the 1990s could learn a thing or two from my doctoral dissertation. Not the easiest argument to make, given that my topic was the Arabic translations of Plotinus, right? So you're sort of explaining maybe something from the perspective of a recently graduate student in the history of philosophy, trying to somehow pitch his competences as a historian. But then you add, and this is a relevant part maybe of the question I had. In my heart, I never really believed that this was the only or even the best rationale for studying the history of philosophy. Certainly, historical texts have contributed to contemporary debates, but to me, much of the fascination of the historical figures is how far they were from our ways of thinking, rather than how up-to-date we can make them seem. I find it fascinating that long-dead philosophers assume certain things to be obviously true, which now seem obviously false, and that they build elaborate systems on these exotic foundations. To be useful, historical ideas don't always need to fit neatly into our ways of thinking. They can shake us out of those ways of thinking, helping us to see that our own assumptions are a product of a specific time and place. Sorry for the long quote, but so the question concern I had in mind on the face of this quote is the following, right? Many programs that, let's say, have courses that make students read the great books written by the great philosophers from different historical periods aim to the idea or goal to make those authors relevant to the concerns that students have nowadays, right? But like sometimes you wonder, like they reach this goal through, let's say, a waterboarding process of the text or the philosopher in question, right? So it's not so much that they care about the problems that these philosophers had in mind, or to be, let's say, perceptive of the issues that they were trying to address, the people they were trying to discuss with. but rather it is all a matter of like making those authors from bygone eras, let's say, contemporary again, right? And I don't know, if let's say we have a divide here, I would find myself much more on your side of things, so to speak. I mean, in terms of the reasons you might have for studying these dead people, right? Than in this other reason, which is like making them relevant again, or making them speak about the pandemic, or I don't know, neoliberalism or racism, you name it, really.
Yeah, so I guess we agree about this. This might be because you went to King's to some extent. I mean, I guess there's a very obvious way in which what I'm doing is doing the history of philosophy as a kind of history, as well as a kind of philosophy, right? So this idea of doing it in chronological order, step by step, looking at minor figures who may not even have very much original to say, but kind of tell you something about the way philosophy was received in a certain period, for example. Mm-hmm. That there you can really see that I'm doing the history of philosophy as a historical project. And so I think that when people see that kind of approach, it's very natural for them to say, well, that's not really why I'm interested in the history of philosophy. I'm interested in the history of philosophy because I'm interested in philosophy. And the reason why I'm interested in philosophy is that I want to know what's true. So unless you can show me something true in these figures, I don't care, right? So as far as I'm concerned, maybe in Advaita Vedanta, there's a convincing argument, but you better show it to me and tell me why it's convincing, right? So I think that actually makes a lot of sense. Like I can see why someone might feel that way. And, people often draw the comparison to the history of science, right? Scientists don't mostly know anything about the history of science, or they don't feel that they need to, because they assume that all the stuff that isn't still kind of retained in modern science is just the stuff that was wrong, and we don't need to know about that. So similarly, let's say Neoplatonism, we don't have Neoplatonism anymore because it's false anyway. So it died deservedly, right? So I think what that misses is, and this is just spelling out the thought behind the passage you read, what that misses is the fact that as philosophers, we really should be trying to see our own intuitions and even our concerns, like what we find interesting, as something that is itself worthy of being problematized or reflected upon. So, for example, if you're particularly concerned with, let's say, gender equality or racial equality because it's 2020 and these issues are in the news, then you should also bear in mind that you're living in a particular historical moment, and that historical moment is probably shaping the way you think about those issues very strongly, and that you need some perspective on that to think about it philosophically, whatever your position is or is ultimately going to be. And I think the best way we have of getting perspective on our own intuitions, concerns, beliefs, assumptions is to look at the concerns and assumptions that people had in other times and places. Because we can't sort of make up some science fiction philosophy that hasn't existed yet and study it carefully. The only way we can step outside of our own moments and place and culture is to look at other cultures, places, and times. And that just is the history of philosophy. So something else I often say about this is that what the philosophy that's going on right now is just the most recent part of the history of philosophy. And in some ways, it's on a par with every other part, right? Yeah. It just so happens that we're living in this part. And so, the historian of philosophy is the one who's best equipped to kind of jump up and look at it all from above and see how the parts interrelate. And I think the more that you insist that the historian of philosophy speak to contemporary concerns and kind of deliver arguments from old texts that sound right or make intuitive sense to us, the more you insist on that, the more you're undercutting the power of the history of philosophy to do the thing that it's best at doing, which is to remove you from your current point of view and give you a different point of view.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, that's interesting. Maybe in relation to that, I was wondering. So I'm thinking partly on what you've written precisely on the podcast side about the rules for doing history of philosophy, partly on some other things written in the sort of sphere of internet philosophy blogs, which relates to the issue of charity, right? So it seems to be fairly reasonable that the charity principle not only should apply to our like contemporary or synchronic interlocutors, but also when dialoguing with the figures of the past, right? Do you think, nonetheless, that there could be something good or fruitful that could come out, let's say, from a more adversarial approach to historical figures, right? I mean, I think one can see the virtues or the pros, right, of the sort of a more charitable interpretation approach, right? And but like maybe this is perhaps like making you say something about the sort of the different or like opposite approach to historical figures. Anyways, I'm thinking particularly also stuff that Eric Schwitzgebel has written in his blog, the Crooked Temple, which maybe I don't entirely agree, but I think they're interesting nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say about that follows from what I was just saying about this purpose of the history of philosophy. Mm-hmm. Because in a way, I think that contrast itself is kind of an artifact of this demand that the historical text either convinces us or doesn't, mm-hmm. like from our own point of view, right? And so our job is to either show that it's well thought through and convincing, there's the principle of charity, or that it's not, and like analyze where things went wrong, right? Whereas that's not really what I'm trying to do for the most part. What I'm trying to do for the most part, and I'm not saying this is the only legitimate thing to do, I'm just sort of describing I'm describing my philosophical taste or my instincts. So my instinct is more to try to understand from the inside what the philosopher is doing. So try to like see where they're coming from, see if I see an argument that doesn't look like it makes sense, I try to understand why the author thought it made sense. But the reason for that is not so much that I'm using the principle of charity, right. It's that I want to understand why the author thought it made sense when it doesn't seem to make sense to me.
Right.
Right. So again, it's this kind of like trying to get out of myself and see it from their point of view. That's of course that doesn't mean that philosophers don't ever make mistakes. I mean, you can find invalid arguments, and there's no problem with pointing that out. And also, I do think that it's extremely useful in teaching to get students to be engaging critically with the texts from early on, like even first semester. Right. So that, I mean, I always noticed this when I was teaching ancient philosophy at King's, that a typical assignment would be like, okay, you've been at university for 2 weeks, read this page of Plato, explain the argument, and criticize it. And in a way, like, this is absurd, right? So here you have someone who's been doing philosophy for less than 20 days, and you're telling them to criticize Plato. And like in some ways, that seems kind of just bizarre. But on the other hand, I think it's appropriate because it's a way of using historical texts to give students these very fundamental philosophical skills of interpreting texts, trying to draw the argument out of the text, and then thinking about problems that might be posed to the author. So I think that's all very useful as a kind of training exercise. And I still do that in Germany, where that's not nearly as much the case, actually. They're not nearly as much trained here in criticisms at historical texts as is the case in the US and especially in the UK. But I don't really think that's what I'm doing as a historian of philosophy. I'm not looking for objections, except insofar as I want to know, like, if there is an objection, why hasn't the author thought of it, or have they thought of it and there's some reason, right? Is it not salient for some reason? So I'm always much more interested in like trying to see it from their point of view, and all of that analytical business that I hopefully learned when I was a student myself is helping me do that. It's not just a matter of like giving them a B+ or a C- on how well they argued.
Right. So let me see if I could maybe propose a couple question themes to just finish this first part of the panel. I mean, you take whatever time you see fit to each of them. So maybe the first of these two topics is the issue of like philosophers defending repugnant views, right? And I just maybe wanted to know what do you make of this when it comes, let's say, to teaching, or in the case of the podcast, how to deal with that? What do you think, for instance, of this should have known better arguments, like as in, well, I mean, Hume, for instance, in the inquiry defends repugnant views about women, but Hume was such a clever guy that he should have been able to see over the prejudices of his time, therefore shame on Hume. That's the first topic. And the second one is something that really relates more to your, let's say, aesthetic preferences. And it is something that I think gave you a warning about. And it is, why do you think that any philosophy course on the, let's say, history of Western tradition should by any means include the study of Plotinus and Avicenna?
Right. Okay. So as far as the first thing goes, I mean, yeah, of course, that's in the news a lot, right? They just renamed David Hume Tower at the University of Edinburgh not because of his remarks on women, but because of his remarks on race, or I should say, his racist remarks.
Right.
So I guess that what I have to say about that, again, has to do with this, like trying to understand things from the inside, right? And in fact, in a way, this issue makes that project more problematic, because why would I want to understand the world from the point of view of a racist, right? Well, but actually, as soon as I say that, like the answer presents itself, we need to understand racism, right, to combat it. So actually, there's a very good reason why we would want to understand the history of sexism, the history of racism, everything that came with it. And actually, one thing that I do find problematic here is that this kind of instinct to say, oh, well, that's just one footnote in Hume, and he should have known better, or maybe he shouldn't have, but we can kind of isolate that and not worry about it. Like, that's the racist footnote, and the rest of Hume I love, so I'll kind of ignore that, right? Or Aristotle on natural slavery would be another example, right? Or, any number of viciously sexist things that pretty much every philosopher, whoever says anything about women before 1900, with a few exceptions, can be accused of. So I think that the problem with that is that, in a way, the historian of philosophy there is failing to do what we usually do as a matter of course, which is try to contextualize what these historical philosophers say, and see how it connects to everything else they say. So, like, for example, if Plato gives an argument in the Phaedo about proving the immortality of the soul on the basis that we recollect forms that we saw before we were born, of course, you contextualize that by looking at the theory of recollection in the Meno, but also you look at the Theaetetus, what he has to say about knowledge there, etc. Right? So you try to kind of create a web around your passage that helps you understand the passage and helps you see how it fits into his overall worldview, right? Whereas when Aristotle says, oh, women have no control over their rational faculty, or they're natural slaves, people sometimes have the opposite reaction, which is to kind of like take a knife and cut the passage out and put it out on the racism table, and then leave everything else with this hole. But actually, I think it would be much more useful to think about, okay, so what does Aristotle's view on natural slavery have to do with his views on other topics, right? Like what, so for example, how would his cosmological and natural philosophical theories explain the mechanisms by which natural slaves are produced, right? So I'm in favor of contextualizing these things and trying to understand them as part of the whole package. And insofar as you're just a historian of philosophy, the issue of like condemning or not condemning doesn't really arise. Right. So the point of the goal of the historian of philosophy is to understand. Once you've understood it, then you can kind of step back in your role as, member of society and decide whether or not you want to rename David Hume Tower. But I don't think that decision is a decision you're making as a historian of philosophy. It's a political decision.
Right.
Do you want me to go on to talk about Plotinus and Avicenna too?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a perk that obviously you get for your the kind of yeah.
So
I wouldn't want to keep you not to say something about Plotinus and Avicenna.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so I love Plotinus and I love Avicenna, obviously, and I think it would be great if they were taught more often. In part because they're just so incredibly influential. So I think it's a little bit strange to come out of a BA in philosophy without knowing anything about Plotinus and Avicenna, because, I mean, if for the sake of argument, if we accept this notion of Western and European philosophy, so philosophy that starts in Greece and then comes down to now, right? I guess that on any reckoning, Plotinus and Avicenna are two of the 10 most influential figures in that story. And so if you don't know anything about them at all, you've really missed something. I mean, it would sort of like well, I have a degree in American history, but I don't know anything about the Civil War.
Right. So
it's like something has gone wrong there. Okay. So I think like the historical influence that they both exercised is definitely a reason why they should be studied. However, I do also think that this whole like kind of competition to decide which figures and texts should be in the canon and which shouldn't, whereby people like me typically say, oh, well, everyone should really read some Avicenna. So now we have to think about who to kick out of the canon to make space, right? And we're going to have to read some women philosophers nowadays because we know we should do that. So we have to kick out some men and so on. So I actually think that in a way that whole discussion proceeds from an indefensible premise, which is that there is one best way to understand and learn about the history of philosophy. So in fact, and this goes back to what I was saying about why I did the podcast in the first place, you cannot cover the history of philosophy in an undergraduate degree because you don't have time, any more than you could cover the history of the world in an undergraduate degree, right? Or the whole history of science in an undergraduate degree. And so when you make your choices about what to teach, I think if you're telling yourself, we teach what we teach because we're teaching all the most important things, and we're leaving the other stuff out because it's not as important, then you've already made a huge mistake it doesn't matter what's on your list of most important things. The list of most important things, I guarantee you, is not something you can cover in a BA degree unless your BA degree takes 20 years or at least 10 years, right? It's just not going to happen, right? Because even if you include Avicenna, you won't do Scotus. If you do Scotus, you won't do Occam. If you do Avicenna, Scotus, and Occam, you won't do Hildegard of Bingen, right? There's too many major figures in the history of philosophy to cover all the major figures. Never mind trying to understand the contributions of minor figures, which I'm also in favor of. Right. So I just think people should take a different objective. So rather than trying to devise a canon, which is the same everywhere for all departments, I think it would be great if there were more diversity in our teaching. Like if, some universities, they only do Chinese philosophy. Like that would be great.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, so I just wanna, so leave this conversation here and maybe start taking questions from the audience. So there are a few written down already. So I'm gonna say something in Spanish and then maybe get back to the questions. La idea entonces, perdón, para los que siguen aún en el panel, es que dejen sus preguntas en el chat de la sesión. Pueden ser en inglés, pueden ser en castellano, no hay problema. En la medida que el tiempo lo permita, intentaremos irlas leyendo. ¿Bien? Voy a comenzar entonces con algunas preguntas que ya están escritas en el chat. So I think, Peter, you see the questions that are written on the Q&A window. So maybe you could take the second one if you're allowed with that.
Yeah, I get that question a lot. So the whole India-Europe thing. I mean, we didn't...
okay.
That's right.
Let me read it first because I think we are the only ones who are able to see it. So Eduardo Fuentes is asking, in the India series, they decided not to compare, so you and your co-host, not to compare Indian philosophy to European philosophy. However, there are striking similarities. Do you have any explanation for that? And has that impacted the way you see philosophy in general?
Yeah, so we actually we actually said something about that in the podcast, in the book, namely that, which I guess this questioner must be thinking of, which is that we were going to kind of resist the temptation to constantly draw comparisons between, for example, ancient Indian atomism and ancient Greek atomism. Okay, so and one reason I didn't want to do that was kind of pragmatic, namely I didn't want to have to explain the European stuff every time, and I also didn't want to assume that the reader knows the European stuff. But I think also I wanted to make sure that we were trying to understand the Indian material on its own terms. And I think that if you say, well, we're going to talk about Vaisheshika, which is a school of atomism in ancient India. So I'll start by talking about Democritus. So here's what Democritus says about atoms. Now let's talk about how Vaisheshika is different. Well, you could do that, and that could be interesting. But of course, you're already kind of stacking the deck against Vaisheshika by bringing in a whole set of concepts and questions that come from this other context, right?
Right.
And I think that this kind of comparative work is worthwhile and even important. But to me, it presupposes that you've already made a pretty serious effort to understand both things that you're comparing before you start comparing them.
Right.
Right. So just as you wouldn't like decide whether to have A or B for dinner in an informed way unless you have already eaten A and B and you know what they taste like. Right. So that was really the thought there, was that the point of that book and series was to explain Indian philosophy in its own terms. We do have some chapters at the end of the book where we talk about possible influence of Indian philosophy on European philosophy. So that we do talk a little bit about the interchange between the two. But I see there's this question about Rorty and his 4 ways of doing it. I'm not sure I have that enough in my head to comment on it, to be honest. I mean, I know what he's talking about, and I think I read it in grad school.
Right. Yeah, I couldn't help with that either. So maybe we could move to the next one.
Actually, there's one of the questions that you already dismissed is about whether Spanish is part of Western philosophy. I guess because I said
sure. I made a
Latin.
mistake about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So because I would like to say something about that.
Right. Yeah.
So I mean, just in general, there's a really interesting phenomenon which happens around the period I've been working on recently in the podcast, which is the appearance of philosophy in vernacular languages.
Yeah,
And it
exactly.
happens a little bit already in the medieval period. So in particular, women often write in the vernacular, but also figures like Meister Eckhart, for example, writes in German.
Right.
And then it really starts happening in the Renaissance. So already like Dante writes philosophy in Italian in the 14th century. And then you have Machiavelli writing in Italian, as I mentioned before. And that then kind of happens all over Europe in basically the early modern period, or the Renaissance into early modernity, including, of course, in Spanish. Okay, so I did when I sort of reeled off that list of the 5 great languages of philosophy, namely Greek, Latin, English, French, and German. I wasn't meaning to exclude the other philosophical language traditions as being worthy of study. I was really trying to explain why the texts that we do read get read. And basically my thought was, well, we read the texts that are available to someone who has kind of standard education that you would get in 19th century or early 20th century in, Oxford.
Right. Exactly.
And that might include Spanish, but probably not. And so actually I think that there's an extent to which Spanish language philosophy tends to get ignored simply because it's in Spanish. Because unless you, all of you know Spanish, obviously, but your average British or American historian of philosophy may not even occur to them to go read philosophy that was written in Spanish, and then you have to come to grips with like Latin American culture and so on. So I think that that's exactly why I want to do this series, or one of the reasons I want to do this series on philosophy in the Americas.
Yeah, no, that sounds sensible. And a very interesting point. I don't know, Peter, if you wanna move to the next question about
racism.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a question about whether we have podcasts about the roots of racism. Boy, oh boy, do we have podcasts about that. Yes. So over the last, I guess, must be at least 2 years, I've been doing philosophy on Africana philosophy. I've been doing podcasts with Chike Jeffers about Africana philosophy. And a lot of that has dealt with 19th century, actually even late 18th century and 19th century Africana thought. And Africana here includes what happens in the African diaspora, as well as what happens in Africa itself. So we've talked a lot about, pseudoscientific theories of racism and how they were critiqued by Black authors. We've talked about slavery and the many philosophical issues that surround slavery and so on. So actually racism is, I would say, one of the topics now that we've covered the most in the podcasts.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a next question of an anonymous attendee about historical research and history of philosophy, which is, I think, is something that you brought up on the podcast, maybe from the perspective of which topics to cover. I mean, why, let's say, back in the day you excluded having episodes on Thucydides or Herodotus, but now you find yourself writing and making a podcast on Renaissance and economics, or Renaissance historiography, etc.
Yeah, so I think just in general, if you ask me, how much do the historian of philosophy know about whatever, I'm always going to lean towards saying as much as possible. So, everything from the material conditions under which books were produced, like what were they writing on? What were they writing with? How were books copied? How were they stored? I think a historian of philosophy would do well to know those things. And they would do well to know, the socioeconomic condition of the authors. They would do well to know the political context of the period in which the texts were written, and so on. and just in general, I mean, I think that there's almost no limit to the potential value of knowing about historical context for understanding philosophy. So to me, the question of where to stop in finding out about that is much more a pragmatic issue than a philosophical issue. So I mean, I would never say, okay, now I know enough about the historical period, and knowing more would not be useful at this point. I would only stop learning about the historical context because I've run out of time. So, and in fact, actually, whenever I'm getting to a new kind of period in history of philosophy in my podcast, one of the first things that I do is read some straight historical overviews of the period. So for example, it's like when I got to the Italian Renaissance, I read some overviews of like general introductions to Italian Renaissance philosophy, but I also just read some historical works on the Italian Renaissance that were not written with an eye to philosophy. And I'm going to be doing the same thing with the Reformation over the next few months. So I really want to have, like, at least as a kind of background in my head, I want to know like what was going on in all these countries, what was changing in terms of social institutions, political institutions, what were the wars that are going on, you know, who hates who and why, that kind of thing. It's like, it's all very important. But I have to say that it's something that I brought into the podcast more and more as I've gone along. So there's not very much of that in the classical philosophy part. There's very little of it in the classical India one, because Janardan's not very interested in this sort of thing. But I've been trying to bring it in a lot for the medieval, Byzantine, and Renaissance parts. And I'll continue doing that, I think. And of course, the Africana thing, it's everywhere in the Africana series. That's very historically contextualized.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I think those are all the questions that we had written down, and we've been going, I think, for about an hour and 15 minutes. So maybe if there are no further questions, I'd like to ask you one last question, Peter, before we finish the panel. I think within the time range, I promised you this thing would last, and I think it partly connects to some of the things you were saying in your last answer, which is this sort of dispute that at least you find in the Anglophone world developing recently between, let's say, popular philosophy and academic philosophy. So I'm thinking, for instance, in stuff that Nigel Warburton from Philosophy Bites has written down, or Julian Baggini on the one hand, and people like Timothy Williamson from Oxford have written down on the other side. And so one interesting question would be to know maybe where do you see yourself in this debate, having a podcast with a lot of public exposure? I mean, I for one think that if one looks at your episodes or listens to your episodes, you somehow try to cater to both, let's say, type of ends, as it were, like somehow connect with the concerns of like a ordinary person trying to listen something on philosophy, but on the other hand, without like maybe shutting down the door to scholarship and let's say the more technical scholar side of things.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And I mean, more generally, I mean, thank you for saying that. And that's certainly what I'm shooting for. So I'm glad to know that at least some of the time it works. And more generally, I mean, I kind of write two kinds of things, right? So I write research that I know is aimed at specialists and therefore is aimed at a very small audience, mm-hmm. like in the hundreds. And then I'm also writing these podcasts, which are aimed at thousands of people. Or even tens of thousands, hopefully. And so I actually find that I myself, I mean, I kind of embody this tension in my day-to-day life in a way that I guess someone like Nigel doesn't. Because I mean, Nigel used to be a professional philosopher, but now he's kind of a freelance philosophy outreach guy, which is great. So, I mean, I'm not taking anything away from that. I think it's amazing everything that he's done, and he's done a lot for philosophy with that approach. I do tend to disagree with him though about like the kind of technicality and sort of angels dancing on the head of a pin tendencies that he gets very impatient with that. So he's often on Twitter saying things to the effect of like, you know, wouldn't it be better if the philosophers were actually engaging with the issues of the day rather than, you know, drawing very fine distinctions about the differences between externalism and internalism in epistemology or whatever it is that they're doing. And the reason I don't agree with that is in part because I think, popularization, if we want to use that word, doesn't really make sense unless there's something to popularize. So, I mean, even if you think about Philosophy Bites, Nigel's very successful and brilliant podcast, I listened to every single episode. So that, I mean, the reason why that podcast can exist is that he's interviewing people who have written a lot of stuff about philosophy, much of which is often going to be aimed at other experts, right? So they'll come along and, you know, talk about whatever it is, Heidegger or,
Locke.
Attempts to define gender or whatever it is. And these are people who are involved in like extremely dense, difficult, and advanced debates with other members of the same specialist fields. And those are not discussions that anyone without training could appreciate or even follow, but it kind of puts them in a position to speak authoritatively on this subject. And they are very good at finding guests who can do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And similarly, you know, to a large extent, what I'm doing when I write a podcast is I read as much as I have time to in the specialist historical research about whatever it is I'm talking about. And then I kind of squeeze it down into a 25-minute script, right? And if there wasn't all of this, I mean, you know, like a rough, for just to give you an idea of how it relates, a pretty typical kind of ratio would be that I read one journal article and that becomes one paragraph.
Mm-hmm. Okay, right.
So if you imagine the script might be, let's say, 20 paragraphs. So that means 20 book chapters or articles have been squished into this space.
Mm-hmm.
And to some extent, of course, I'm adding my own ideas because there's no one to stop me. But I mean, really, like if I didn't have all of that high level specialized research, I wouldn't know what to say.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, think about, like, imagine if all there is other popularization texts and projects. Well, all I could do is reiterate what they had said. And that's not what I'm trying to do. So I actually think that this relationship between so-called popular and expert philosophy is more like a symbiotic relationship where the two things profit from each other. And so I don't really think we should choose or favor one over the other. I think you can't have one without the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Yeah, that sounds very reasonable. Well, I mean, I think like we will leave the panel of that note. I'd like to thank you again, Peter, for your time and for a very enjoyable conversation.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah.
Sorry I'm coughing. By the way, it's only a cold. I was tested.
All right.
I don't have any.
Yeah, I understand.
I can't infect you over Zoom anyway, but don't worry. I do not have COVID.
Maybe things are not looking great in Germany. I don't know how you're doing, but
yeah, it's getting a lot worse, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think we're just on the low point of the curve, but